Hi, my name's Rowan. I'll be talking about the implications of the federal House of Commons system in Canada. Each province has a certain number of seats in the House of Commons. During an election, citizens vote for the electoral district MPs, not the Prime Minister. Your MP then represents your electoral district or riding in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister elected is the one who has the most seats, which is a first-past-the-post system. Having the most seats doesn't mean they have over half or over 172 of the seats. It just means that candidate had more seats than the other candidates in the running. In a Canadian election, there's a low chance of getting over 50% of the seats, so that brings us to majority and minority governments. A majority government is when the Prime Minister elected has over 50% of the seats, and with that can pass legislation without the support of the opposing parties. When the Prime Minister elected has less than 50% of the seats, that is a minority government. With a minority government, the opposing parties do have a say in which bills are passed. As per the last election, Canada has a minority government with Mark Carney. With that being said, the first-past-the-post system doesn't account for people who choose not to vote. When people don't vote, this distorts the true proportions of the election and as a result causes a lower amount of representation from the citizens. It's known as a wasted vote. There are also citizens whose party did not win the majority of the seats. These citizens, in turn, are not represented by the party elected. The first-past-the-post system wins all the seats and represents only those citizens that voted for that party's MP.
Based on my research, I'm going to be talking about how our electoral system within Canada is not producing governments and MPs that are truly representative of Canadian identity. My main focus is Indigenous peoples, minorities within Canada. Within Canada, there are 640 First Nations, not including Métis or Inuit. Each Indigenous nation has a unique relationship with the state. These Indigenous representatives existing in two worlds of politics. Indigenous representatives must balance advocating for Indigenous peoples, but also the nation's concerns, to maintain the ability for re-election. Though most of the time Indigenous officials don't accommodate or reward advocacy for Indigenous peoples, and there's many incentives which push these officials in a different direction as they're trying to get bills to pass. There is often very little electoral incentives to prioritize the needs of Indigenous peoples, making them less interested in voting in federal elections. When a representative that will represent Indigenous values in a community is elected, they are still subject to party discipline, which renders their ability to freely influence others. First to pass the post electoral systems and single-member districts means that the individual candidates must be elected and re-elected within a geographic defined contingency. These differ in the proportions of Indigenous residents. Some ridings are more heavily Indigenous compared to others. It also makes it hard to gain representation within the House of Commons, as the Indigenous Act and the Canadian Election Act made it so Indigenous peoples with their status weren't allowed to be elected officials until the 1960s. And since then, only 49 self-identified Indigenous people have been MPs. There's significant gaps between minorities voting in federal elections within Canada, Black voters facing the most significant gap of 16%, below the voting white counterparts. The gap is most prominent among second-generational racialized Canadians. Racialized minorities are 6% less likely to vote in federal elections. This is attributed to lower levels of socioeconomic resources. Being embedded within social networks like churches or organizations, you are more likely to be asked to participate in voting. Education is one factor often included to explain voter turnout. Social identity theory sees identification with a group as a source of positive self-image, but also due to past experiences of exclusion and discrimination, they hold a reduced sense of belonging to national communities. The solution, group-based resources, can boost minorities' voter participation. Churches and shared group identities are some examples. In research, racialized citizens are often overlooked by campaign parties and candidates, as they focus more on reliable voters or large voting groups. If we change that by providing organized communities and boosting education, while also providing campaigns that engage minorities into voting in elections to have their voice heard. With all these concerns, how should we fix Canada's electoral system?
Good question. As Canada right now uses a first-past-post system, the elected Prime Minister is only representative of those who voted for his party's MPs. The rest of the citizens that did not vote for that party are not taken into account, and as a result, have a Prime Minister who does not match their ideological views. There will always be a part of the population of Canada that are not represented. To correct the misrepresentation of said citizens, we propose the idea of a proportional representation system. In a proportional representation system, voter support is a key principle. By voting for the MP in your district, you're being represented. Proportional representation uses a multi-party system, so rather than electing one MP who represents a portion of the population like in first past the post, you're electing a team of MPs to represent everyone who voted for them.
Ooh, that actually makes sense. If we adopted the proportional representation system, it would represent Indigenous and minorities voting patterns. The amount of votes would represent the amount of seats. So even if there's a small percentage of the minorities or Indigenous people in each riding, their vote still counts for something, even if it's not the majority consensus. Using this system in our Canadian government system would help better represent all different opinions, identities, and culture that makes up Canada today. And with changing parts of the campaigning process, education, and shifting to proportional representation system, citizens can have more of an impact on who governs the country. And in turn, more people will be motivated to vote.
Exactly.